Welcome back to the 1619 Project podcast. My name is Antonio Ruiz, here with my compatriot and partner in crime,
Thomas Field.
Because there's definitely a lot of crime going on here.
A lot of crime. Between these pages, there's a lot of crime.
And I mean that in the nicest way. Well, today we're down to the last two chapters, and today's chapter 17, Progress. And I really do have to read this opening line of the chapter, or it's in the paragraph. What we mean when we say America is exceptional, that not that our nation has been flawless from the start, but that we have shown the capacity to change and make life better for those who follow. This was President Barack Obama in his farewell address in January 2017, just days before Donald Trump took office. And yet many Americans did not see a more perfect union coming, because Donald Trump was getting ready to be inaugurated as president. And after the last 6 years, I think we've shown pretty well what many people actually predicted before Obama took office, and after he took office, which was that America just couldn't stand the idea of a Black man becoming president of the United States. And that the backlash to that is what helped elect Donald Trump, among many other reasons. But that was definitely a reason. And, you know, it's an interesting chapter because it tries to tell us on the one hand or points out that we have embraced a national mythology in this country, that we are marching forward, that we're righting past wrongs, and yet the reality is that for every step forward, sometimes this country takes 10 steps backwards. You notice I didn't say 2 steps backwards. But I maintain that yes, the question really is what is progress and how do you measure progress? And is progress even for everybody? I'll start off with that for your comment.
Nothing wrong with that comment. I mean, it's pretty accurate. I think one of the things that I try to do is look at the long picture, the big picture, the long term. If I'm able to do that, then I can be optimistic about the future. But as you so rightly and aptly pointed out, for every one of those steps forward, there is definitely a white backlash. And you can see that at every instance where there's been any kind of forward progress by people of color. It is inevitably followed by white backlash.
Yeah. I mean, I was reading also somewhere else where it talked about, if you think about the 60s and the civil rights era, and how everybody cheered the passage of the two 64 and 65 Civil Rights Acts, and you talk about, everybody starting to cheer, and right into the 70s, into the 80s. And yet, if you stop and think about every effort at quote unquote integration that had to do with busing, like point to Boston as a great example. But in other cities around this country where there was a resistance to, I hate to use the word integration because it connotates so many different things, but where there were efforts to take advantage, let's say, of the 64 and 65 housing, 65 Civil Rights Acts, particularly when it came to housing, for instance, in the North and the resistance to that. And then you fast forward to the 2000s and the efforts to suppress voting, And even when you start to talk about our Supreme Court, you know, things like getting rid of the Voting Rights Act or nullifying elements of the Voting Rights Act. These are all examples of, you know, the backlash that keeps coming back. And I guess I want to just point to this one other quote here. When seen as a defining narrative of American history, this vision of our past as a march of racial progress is a historical, mythical, and incomplete. Even as those civil rights victories of the 1950s and 60s were transpiring in the courts and the streets, the unemployment rate of Black Americans was rising. These persistently poor socioeconomic conditions, not to mention police violence, led to urban rebellions in 64, 65, 66, and 67, a year when Martin Luther King Jr. said that the dream that I had that day in 1963 has at many points turned into a nightmare. And so here we are in 2022. How would we measure the progress since those days of the 60s?
Well, you know, you asked that up front. If you look back at Reconstruction, and you know, Reconstruction was a major leap forward from the Emancipation Proclamation, and there was, you know, if only we had enforced the rights of those newly freed enslaved people, we would be in a different place today. But that didn't happen. But there was a backlash, and that backlash, which came 12 years later, resulted in probably worse than it was before with slavery, because you had to have a brutal suppression. During that time, there was insurrection. The only successful insurrection in this country's history took place in Wilmington, Delaware, where a duly elected government was overthrown by a mob. And the federal government did not respond, did not send troops down, did nothing. And that white mob and the government was not a Black government, it was a multiracial government. The people who decided to rule themselves under due process of law and through the ballot box. And so there was that reaction and that backlash. But back to one of the central things for me, comes back to all of this, is this is ultimately about money, about cash, about capital. And you know, I
see that, Thomas, as a real theme in the last few chapters.
Yeah, and to me, you know, for example, the probably most vehement backlash took place in Tulsa, took place in Greenwood, took place in another city in Florida, where Blacks,
Rosewood,
thank you, had built thriving cities, thriving economies, and it was shown that they were looked at and said, we're going to put that down because we do not want a thriving Black community among our midst. And they burnt both of those communities down, as well as others. And I mentioned Wilmington, but Rosewood, there's Tulsa. There's at least 6 other examples I can cite where the backlash was violent because people deemed that they were equal enough to acquire capital.
You know, we've been talking a lot about economic political power. And I think, I'm trying to remember if it's in this chapter, the next one, where conservatives, Republicans love to talk about how much progress we've made in this country. And one of the things that they point to is, particularly during the Reagan era, I remember this, they point to the growing middle class of African Americans, Black Americans. They talk a lot about immigrants in this country, about Latinos, although it's interesting, again, my thing is this idea of lumping all people that we might describe as Latinos together, because Cubans have a different story
Sure.
than Mexican Americans, particularly, and even in that group, there's new immigrants versus people who've been here for several centuries. But they love to lump all these people together and say, look, we're not racist. The system is not racist. Look at all the progress that these people make. So there must be another reason that Black Americans have not created as much wealth as everybody else. And I just, as I'm going through some of these things here in this chapter, the thing that kind of keeps coming back to me is a combination of both the, at the time and even still today, legal restrictions that are imposed on African Americans in this country, Black Americans, both in terms of whether it's, and we've talked about this before, redlining, the ability, racism when it comes to this the dispensing of mortgage loans. You take all those things together, and it's like, and then on top of that, the war on drugs and mass incarceration of the 1980s and 90s. It's like all of that gets sort of like pushed to the background, and very few people. I mean, I just remember with the publication of this book, the backlash against it, as if they were like creating a whole new narrative that all these things did not exist, and if they did exist, well, that was in the 1800s. And I don't know how, no matter how many times you point out the economic issues, the political issues, it just keeps getting pushed back by Republicans and conservatives as if this was another century.
It's one way of looking at this is the way George Orwell talked about the use of language by the oppressor. If this country were another country and we were looking at it, we would call what takes place in this country basically state-sponsored terrorism. Okay. And that it's been the theme back during the after the Civil War, after Reconstruction. It's been a theme of lynching that took place in the South. It continues today with the state using police forces to basically keep down people they deem to be a threat. And that often means anybody who's Black or anybody who's of another color. The percentage of, and we're not talking about people that were killed because they were criminals. Because when a state wants to deem a person a criminal, they can make anyone a criminal. We're talking about unarmed citizens. And until recently, we didn't acknowledge that because there wasn't a camera around. When people were saying that's police brutality, the excuse that was given by liberals and conservatives was, oh no, he was reaching for a gun, or likely the cop felt that his life was in danger. Every possible excuse was given when a person of color was killed. Now the cameras depict what happens. The language has been used now. Isn't sufficient.
Yeah.
And again, when you as a country or society can use language, you can diffuse a lot of things, and you can obfuscate a lot of shit. And that is what we've seen in this country. That to me is as big a deal as anything of redlining, of denial of your rights, is the way the state has been able to keep people from addressing and getting redress.
Yeah, we saw that in 2020 during the rebellions across the country in reaction to the number of police brutality issues, incidents, where at first there was this great outpouring of support. A lot of people took to the streets. This is, of course, during when Trump was in office. And what I've seen since then, now part of the problem was that this happened during the pandemic, and so there was a lot of things going on in social media. But the narrative that started to emerge, or the backlash to those protests, was and right-wing media was really good at this. They were just basically Antifa. It was Black Lives Matter had turned from a pro-social justice movement into they were just as bad as Antifa. They would point to the accounts of violence, which were by any measure a very small percentage of the protests across this country. So here we are in 2022. I got to tell you something. I don't see a lot of people talking about those protests anymore. In the media, I'm talking about. And that if they do bring it up, it's being brought up by the right-wing media as examples of the rebellion that was not put down, and that when they looked at January 6th, the first reaction was, well, yeah, but look at those protests in 2020. Why weren't those people arrested and persecuted and all those other things? I mean, I say all of this because it's this part of this narrative that as part of the backlash, that every time there's an effort to focus on these truths, that the right-wing media, conservative, Republican, are able to twist things around. And I have to say that they're not the liberal media, the mainstream media, I put that in word quotes, not good at countering that narrative.
Oh, why should they? They're part of that problem. And I give you an example. When there are these civil disturbances, which would be neutral language. Civil disturbance would be a neutral language to use to describe these things.
Right.
They're called riots.
Yeah.
Riots depict something which is not politically based, not driven for any kind of thing other than wild mobs out there basically looting. And that's the other thing that the mainstream media does not. The right-wing media doesn't lead with that. It's the mainstream media. When there's these civil disturbances, they then show looting. And it's violence against property, which often these, and I prefer to call them either civil disturbances or insurrections. But what happens is they ignore what's precipitated this, which is often violence against persons, often people who are unarmed persons. And when there's violence against property, what gets the bigger play is that violence against property that elevates beyond the violence against those individuals who were by police action, who were killed or beaten by police unfairly. So to me, that's where you get this thing of language and how you use language to basically put down people who are actually acting in their best interest for social justice.
Right. And again, I keep coming back to the percentage of those violent incidents. And yes, I agree with you. They're usually, listen, I've learned something from the 60s, which is the idea of burning down our own neighborhoods to me has always been, from a political, strategic perspective, always like the dumbest thing that we end up doing. But We're angry and we want to burn down our neighborhoods
But Antonio,
personally.
think about it. It's problematic, yes. But
Well,
here's
but I'm just saying. My point is that still it's a small percentage
yes, I agree.
of the social protest. And what happens is, and I saw this when I wrote about it, is I criticize those actions not because I thought that I wanted to focus on those actions, but because I thought that what was happening was that no one was then talking about all the other things that go on politically, um, you know, progressive actions that happen in reaction not only to those um, police actions, but because once again we got so into like, oh, they burned down the clothing store over there in the corner. And I'm thinking to myself, tragic. But wait a second. Here's like 100 other people who are doing more positive things in the community in reaction to those police actions, who are getting involved politically, but nobody talks about those people. Nobody thinks about those people. The same thing about Chicago. Chicago is another great example. Yes, there's a lot of violence in Chicago, but nobody wants to talk about, one, where do they get those guns? Two, nobody wants to talk about the 100 other people, the pastors and the neighborhood people who are out there every day trying to maintain peace in their communities, because that's not sexy. That is just not sexy. And the mainstream media is the biggest, the old adage, if it bleeds, it leads. Nobody cares about a group of mothers, marching down the street, protesting violence in their community. Who cares? And these continued narratives, I think, do more than just obfuscate, to use his words in this chapter, but actually kind of create this what's the word I'm looking for? There's almost mythology that takes over the narrative, so that after a while you forget all the social justice work that's being done because it's just not sexy.
Yeah. Let me say this.
And obfuscates whatever progress there is being made, but worse, obfuscates the problems that still have to be overrun, not overrun, but dealt with.
Let me just state this, because there is this myth that burning down our neighborhoods. How stupid is that? And on the face of it, you're right. It is stupid. Okay, but and particularly true in the '60s, which is when this was happening. But when one examines who owned that property that was being burned down in the '60s in those neighborhoods, they were absent landlords. There were predatory store owners from outside those neighborhoods who were charging prices which were far exceeded what they could get across town. And they also provided places where people shopped, which were with goods that were substandard goods. Liquor stores. There were far more liquor stores per block in those communities than there were anywhere else. Okay. So when you talk about burning down neighborhoods, our own neighborhoods, understand something. Those people living there did not see ownership in those neighborhoods. So to them, I'm not burning down my house. I'm burning down a house. I'm burning down an establishment which was owned by an outsider. So let's put that in perspective, when you start talking about that, okay? And the other thing, too, which needs to be spoken about, which I think this book talks about it, but it needs to come together with, once again, an overview. When riots started happening in the '60s, they call them riots, okay? And they portrayed how these are Black people out there in the streets being lawless. What was lost in this was that the riots that took place in the '30s, the '40s, and the '50s were whites rioting, and they were rioting against Blacks. And I started in the '30s. I probably should start before that.
Yes.
Okay. And that, again, when we pinpoint black riots. You see on television, people running with TVs. But they don't put a equal narrative together about the number of whites that went into communities, and there's not a single city in this country where those white riots did not take place, and they came in and burned and looted and killed black people. So my point is, that's how we get to where we are in terms of media. Media focused on black rioters. It did not talk about the white rioters.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the byproduct of that narrative is that after a while, even quote unquote liberal politicians begin to go, well, I'm not going to get involved in that. I'm not going to touch that. So efforts to correct the underlying problems and issues get like, I'm not touching that. Police reform is a wonderful, wonderful example of that.
It is that.
Remember we were all about, we've got, whether you supported the idea of defund the police, which I find, I'm laughing now as I hear Republicans talk about defund the FBI, defund the police, or whether you wanted to embrace the other other title about police reform. It's like now when everybody talks about crime increasing, what's everybody's response? We've talked about this before. Oh, we need to give the police actually more money, not less money. Move money over to mental health? Not just yet. We first have to, strengthen them so that they can fight against crime. And somehow we went from 2020 and the idea, the discussion of police reform and dealing with, again, underlying issues of police brutality in the neighborhoods and the communities. And now I don't even know where we are.
Well, using that term or phrase, mental health. We need to fund mental health. Think about it. So people ask to put money in mental health. However, with guns, when we have a mass killing, first thing that's tried out is it's those nuts. It's mental health issues.
Yeah.
It's so again, this is people trying to once again use the language to obfuscate what is plain and obvious and pretty fair. It's about human beings seeking justice, and what you'll find is you'll see that it'll be used to basically deflect that attempt.
I want to read this portion of a paragraph toward the end, which is so important. Because again, this is all about how much progress have we made. But again, I go back to, what do you mean by progress? And more importantly, here we are in 2022. So when the paragraph is, inequality lives in part because Americans of every generation have been misled into believing that racial progress is inevitable and ongoing, that racial progress is America's manifest destiny, that racial progress defines the arc of American history since 1619, that things have changed dramatically. In fact, this has more often been rhetoric than reality, more often myth than history. Saying that the nation can progress racially is a necessary statement of hope. Saying that the nation has progressed racially is usually a statement of ideology, one that has been used all too often to obscure the opposite reality of racist progress. And this idea that we can have progress in the sense if you compare today to 100 years ago and still say that you've moved, using the arc of history, you've moved 5 steps forward, doesn't mean that suddenly you've gotten rid of all the problems, the underlying issues. You still haven't dealt with racism. You still haven't dealt with the black-white gap in this country. You still haven't dealt with police brutality. You still haven't dealt with efforts in the 20 in the second decade of this century, third decade, really. You still haven't dealt with the voter suppression efforts that are being made, and you still have a movement of people, MAGA, who still look at this country as the need to go back, to make America great again. Well, we all know what that means. And I think it's not only a matter of the language, it's a matter of, have we just fooled ourselves into believing that everything is great, we've made great progress, and there's no more work to be done. And that's what I worry about.
Well, yeah. I think
this is the pessimist in me coming out.
No, I think, and I don't think I'm being
necessarily. Can't help myself.
I don't think I'm necessarily being an optimist when I say this. That we have to acknowledge that there has been progress. Otherwise, you get lost in the morass.
Right.
So,
but again,
yes, there has been progress, and there's caveats with that. There have been progress for a group of people who have been educated, who a group of people who have been able to take advantage of it. And among the masses of Black people, that's not as large as those who have been left behind. And one of the ways to hopefully that people can take more advantage of what progress there has been, economic progress has been, is by getting becoming educated. But there is also a thing that I think has to be stated too, which is race has been used as a wedge in this country to keep essentially all people down. And I say all, I'm talking about those who are not a part of the ruling class, not a part of the elite. Those people, the working class in this country, is being whittled down. And until that working class realize that they have got to get together with people of color and exercise their rights, economic rights, what we're going to see is continued decline of a working class, of a middle class. We're seeing it now. It's not just the income, not just a wealth gap between white and blacks, which is horrible, but is also a wealth gap that's increasing between those who are at the top and those that populate the vast majority of people at the bottom. And so I just realized this is more nuanced than just saying
yes.
progress.
And we've been saying that forever.
Yeah, it's a nuanced thing. And until we start recognizing that, we're just playing into the game, into the hands of those who are in power.
Let me ask you this, because this is something that we've talked about before and has actually come up in some of the chapters. This idea of class and race in this country and how they play with each other. And I haven't been able to find a definition that, there's a book out now about the caste system in this country. And which I haven't read yet. This idea that, you're right, this idea of playing with each other. And I'll tell you where I find, particularly here on the West Coast, but I think this is true even on the East Coast, where I find a lot of this class and race issue playing with each other. And that's the relationship between, for lack of a better word to use, Latinos and Black people.
Mm-hmm.
There is, I've met plenty of young Latinos, Latinx, they like to describe themselves, who find themselves in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement.
Mm-hmm.
But I will tell you, there are large groups of Latinos who voted for Trump. Okay, maybe not as many as voted for excuse me, my things keeps falling, that voted for Biden, but more Latinos voted for Trump in 2020 than in 2016. And then when you sit down, you hear some of them talk about the why. Well, some of them point to immigration, but I will tell you something. They were reacting also to the 2020 social justice movements.
Mm-hmm.
Because they thought that Black people, they're always I mean, I've heard this.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard this. Black people always complaining that they're just blah blah blah. We come here, which I always find funny. We come here when so many of them are born here. I just there's this, and funny thing is these are not members of the 1%.
Mm-hmm. So,
and in many cases, they're not even quote unquote defined as middle class. They're sort of lower middle class, working class. And some of the biggest racism that I've seen and heard comes from this group.
Yes.
So you're right. It's kind of playing against one another. And I don't know how because I really do believe we have to start talking more and more about this race and class and everything else sort of in between, because this is where this country is. There's a piece, I'm sorry, but I know we're going to talk about this in the next chapter, but where they talk about the widening immigrant gap, the immigrants versus Black Americans who are obviously born here, and the income disparity among those groups. So anyway, we're going to talk about that.
Let me just say one thing to you, and this will be brief, regarding what you said about class and race. The British perfected this back during their colonial days. It's why a small island was able to basically carve up a lot of the world, because they deployed a strategy called divide and conquer. And what they did, they go into these countries and they look for divisions of people, and they side with one or they side with the other. Sometimes they side with both at various times, and through weakening them, getting and doing some of the natural animosities that were occurred between those groups, they were able to take over. What's been perfected now in this country is, again, that same divide and conquer. As long as you keep people separate on issues that are in their best interests, they have commonality over, you can rule. And that's what you're seeing now a lot. What you're talking about with Latinos, particularly those who have a working class or not even working class. I mean, what they're saying is, hey, we're not Black. Hey, there's an underclass. The underclass is Black. We an underclass. That is what is the outgrowth of that. And it's a very unsophisticated way of looking at what this system is. And the best way to counter that, which is happening now, is for activists and organizers to go in those communities where that's happening and basically talk to people and explain to them and educate them where their best interests lie.
Yeah. One of the final paragraphs, just to me, really summed up where we are in terms of how we need to look at this so-called progress. I mean, there's been progress. I'm not trying to diminish that. I just keep coming back to that we don't spend enough time defining what that means. But it talks about the people bend progress toward justice or injustice. History toward justice or injustice, or equity or inequity. Mm-hmm. The long sweep of America has been defined by two forward motions. One force widening the embrace of Black Americans, and another force maintaining or widening their exclusion. The duel between these two forces represent the duel at the heart of America's racial history. The myth of singular racial progress veils this conflict, and it veils the snowballing racism behind Black people today, still weathering the highest unemployment and incarceration rates and the lowest life expectancy and median wealth compared to other racial groups. Until Americans replace mythology with history, until Americans unveil and halt the progression of racism, an arc of the American universe will keep bending toward injustice.
Mm-hmm.
It's like no matter how much you try to keep looking at this as only a class issue, which some people do, and then don't, it's like, how do I describe this? It's like there's racism pushing up against classism, pushing up against progress. And until we start like looking at these other little, it's like someone, I think you may have said this, until you start dealing with this minutia of laws and compacts and structural things in our country that keep Black Americans from moving forward, but also everyone else, indigenous people, Latinos, and even low income Asian folks, until those things change. And then you're dealing with low income white Americans who think that they're somehow, it's those people over there that are the problem, and we're just minding our own business. If you change all those things, class and racism, or deal with them, we're just still going to continue to bend toward injustice. I'll leave you with the last word.
I don't disagree with much of what you said, but I am hopeful that people will see their best interests lie in coming together. And that doesn't mean I necessarily have to love you. And all it means is that I have to see that we can be allies at certain times in certain places for certain things. That's all you have to do, and that's all you have to say. I believe in the long run. I'm not looking at this being a colorblind society, but I believe in the long run, if we don't destroy ourselves first, we will become a more equitable society, because I think people are going to people are going to awake. And I'm talking, and I don't
you dare use that word.
But see, once again, it gets back to how language is used.
Yeah, that's
the
right.
Class example.
That's right.
And that's what, it's now suddenly woke is the code word for anything having to do with equality.
Yep.
That's another way of saying, it's a dog whistle of the 2020.
Yeah. Anyway, that's it. We'll see you next time. Thank you, Thomas.
Okay, thank you, sir.